Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight, we journey into one of Poirot's most perplexing and sinister cases, the Orchid Cartographer, a Hercule Poirot Mystery. At first glance, it is the quiet tale of a man obsessed with rare flowers, a collector whose maps and journals trace every hidden valley where orchids bloom. But behind the delicate petals lies a labyrinth of deceit, betrayal, and secrets rooted in poison. This cartographer did not just map landscapes. He mapped lives, tracing paths of greed, rivalry, and lust for beauty that turned deadly. When an innocent guest is found lifeless, surrounded by orchids whose fragrance is sweeter than death, Poirot must navigate a world where every flower hides a clue and every map points to a darker truth. The deeper he delves, the more twisted the garden becomes, until even the most perfect bloom seems tainted by corruption. This is not merely a case of murder. It is a journey into obsession, where nature's most fragile creation becomes the deadliest weapon. And in the heart of it all lies a cartographer who may have charted not just orchids, but his own path to destruction. Tonight, step into a world where beauty kills, and every petal carries a secret waiting to be uncovered. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Mapmaker's Garden. The summer sun had begun its slow descent over the rooftops of Brussels, spilling a golden haze across the cobbled streets, when Hercule Poirot found himself summoned by an old acquaintance of curious profession. Monsieur Lucien Armand, a cartographer of some renown, had written to him in a hand that betrayed urgency, inviting Poirot to visit his private residence on the outskirts of the city. What puzzled Poirot most was the manner of the letter. It did not speak openly of danger or crime, but there was in every stroke of ink a trembling unease, a sense that something was out of place, that the writer had seen or discovered more than he wished to commit to paper. And so it was, with curiosity pricked and mustaches neatly groomed, that Poirot made his way toward what was known locally as the Mapmaker's Garden. The house itself was an oddity. Hidden behind high iron gates and a profusion of ivy, it carried the weight of centuries in its bricks, yet the true marvel lay not within the walls but sprawling across the grounds. Lucien Armand's garden was unlike any other, for he had cultivated not flowers or trees for their beauty, but hedges and pathways laid out with precision, echoing the designs of his maps. To step inside was to wander through a labyrinth of miniature landscapes, clipped shrubs that formed coastlines, stone pathways that curved like rivers, and towering hedges cut into the likeness of mountain ranges. At the very center, so rumor claimed, stood a vast compass rose made of white gravel and black slate, aligned with astronomical accuracy. Poirot paused at the threshold, taking in the orderliness of it all, and allowed himself a small smile. It was, he thought, a garden that reflected the mind of its master, meticulous, deliberate, and obsessed with direction. Lucien greeted him with a nervousness that did not suit his otherwise scholarly air. His spectacles slipped low upon his nose, and his ink-stained fingers fidgeted as though they could not rest. He ushered Poirot inside with little ceremony, closing the door as though to keep the world out. "Monsieur Poirot," he said breathlessly, "I thank you for coming. I fear I have entangled myself in something beyond my comprehension." Poirot raised his eyebrows delicately. "Mon ami, you speak as though the maps you draw have turned against you." The cartographer gave a weak laugh, though his eyes darted toward the garden beyond the window. "If only it were so simple," he whispered. It was then that Lucien explained his predicament. For months, he had been working on a commission most unusual, a private map requested by a wealthy patron, a lady of enigmatic character named Madame Delacroix. She had insisted that the map be unlike any other, a chart that did not merely represent geography, but contained within it hidden markings, symbols that appeared to trace a path through history itself. At first, Lucien had dismissed her requests as eccentricity, But the deeper he went into the work, the more he uncovered patterns he could not explain. Cities linked to vanished settlements, rivers aligned with forgotten trade routes, and circles that seemed to echo legends of buried treasure or lost artifacts. He confessed that one night, poring over his drafts by lamplight, he realized that someone had altered his designs. Not clumsily, but with such care that even as trained eye almost missed it. Poirot's attention sharpened at once. "So," he murmured, "the map does not merely chart the land, but it charts secrets. And someone else, they have an interest." Lucien nodded gravely and led Poirot into the heart of his garden. The hedges rustled as the evening breeze crept through them, and the air smelled faintly of chalk and ink, as though the very earth had absorbed the cartographer's trade. They stopped before the compass rose, where on a stone pedestal rested the most recent draft of the mysterious map, weighed down with a glass sphere. Poirot bent over it, his keen eyes noting the precision of the lines, the almost obsessive neatness. Yet he also saw what Lucien meant. Faint symbols etched so lightly that only one accustomed to detail might notice them. Little triangles near the edges of rivers, circles hidden among mountains, stars where no astronomical body ought to be. To any casual viewer, it was a beautiful piece of art. To Poirot, it was something far more deliberate, a code, perhaps, or a trail left for those who knew how to follow. As the two men studied the map, the garden seemed to shift around them. Shadows lengthened across the hedges, and the gravel crunching under their shoes echoed like whispers. Poirot, always sensitive to atmosphere, felt the weight of secrecy pressing close. He asked Lucien whether Madame Delacroix had collected any of his work yet, and Lucien confessed she had taken an earlier version some weeks ago. Since then, he had been followed in the streets by indistinct figures. His study had been disturbed, though nothing stolen. And once he returned home to find the compass rose in his garden, marked with fresh footprints though the gates had remained locked. "Someone wants the map, Poirot," Lucien said, his voice low. "Or worse, they want what the map reveals." Poirot tapped his lips thoughtfully, his eyes glittering. "And you, mon ami, you fear not for your map, but for your life." Lucien did not reply, but his silence was answer enough. At that moment, a sound startled them, a sharp crack of a branch somewhere deep in the garden. Both men turned, but the hedges concealed all. Poirot's expression remained calm, though his mustaches twitched. "It seems, Monsieur Armand," he said softly, "that we are not alone." Chapter 2. The Whisper of Old Papers. The morning after the small disruption of the evening before arrived with a sky of pale gray, as though the heavens themselves had laid a thin veil over the town of St. Lou. The seaside wind, soft yet persistent, pressed against the windows of the modest boarding house where Hercule Poirot had chosen to rest his little gray cells. He was already awake, of course. Hercule Poirot was a man who cherished order, and to him, the rising of the sun signified the necessity of rising oneself. No indulgence in languorous hours beneath the sheets for him. His mustache required grooming, his shoes required shining, and his immaculate attire demanded precision in every fold and crease. He took these small rituals as seriously as a general preparing for battle. As he sipped his morning chocolate, he always preferred chocolate to the harsher bitterness of English tea or coffee. His mind wandered once again to the curious incident of the young woman at the promenade. He had not failed to notice her agitation, the trembling of her hands as though she carried in them the weight of something unspoken. He had also noticed the curious absence of her chaperone upon departure. Poirot, in his own private judgment, did not believe in coincidences. When people behaved irregularly, there was often a reason buried beneath their actions, a reason that required uncovering. The morning brought with it a knock upon his door. It was the landlady, Mrs. Brightwell, a kindly but inquisitive woman whose eyes had the perpetual gleam of someone who enjoyed knowledge of her lodger's affairs. She bore in her hands a stack of letters, most of them for other residents, but one for Poirot himself. With a gracious bow, Poirot accepted the envelope. Its seal bore the crest of a local solicitor's office. That alone intrigued him. For why should a solicitor in this quiet corner of Cornwall have reason to correspond with Hercule Poirot? He slit the envelope carefully, like a surgeon opening the skin of a mystery. Inside, on thick cream paper, was a short but carefully penned invitation. The solicitor, a Mr. Archibald Reed, requested the favor of Poirot's attendance at his office later that afternoon. Matters of some sensitivity had arisen regarding the estate of a recently deceased local gentleman. Poirot raised one elegant eyebrow. He had not come to St. Lou with any intention of entangling himself in affairs of inheritance. Yet the tendrils of mystery had a habit of seeking him out, like moths to a flame. He smiled to himself and placed the letter carefully upon the desk. By midday, the town had begun its customary stir. Shopkeepers lifted shutters. The scent of baked bread drifted from the bakery on the corner, and carriages rattled faintly along the cobbled streets. Poirot, clad in a suit of gray, so immaculately pressed it seemed a crime to crease it, made his way toward Mr. Reed's office. The solicitor's establishment was an old building, its stone walls weathered by years of salt air, its windows shaded with heavy drapery that muted the world outside. Inside, the atmosphere was one of solemn antiquity. The smell of old paper mingled with dust, and a faint note of leather from the bindings of legal volumes that lined the shelves. Mr. Archibald Reed himself was a man whose appearance seemed as carefully drafted as the documents he so clearly loved. Thin, bespectacled, and with hair retreating from a high forehead, he welcomed Poirot with a restrained politeness, offering him a chair before the great desk. Poirot sat, his keen eyes sweeping the room. He saw stacks of yellowing files, pigeonholes marked with faded labels, and atop one cabinet, an ink bottle that had left a faint blue ring upon the wood from decades of use. He missed nothing, not the anxious tapping of Reed's fingers upon his ledger, nor the way the man hesitated before beginning to speak. "Monsieur Poirot," Reed said in a voice that was even but tinged with unease, "I must confess it is not common practice to involve outside parties in matters of probate. Yet circumstances compel me." "Circumstances? They're the friends of Hercule Poirot," said Poirot lightly, his mustache quivering with the faint smile that touched his lips. "Always, it is the little detail, the circumstance overlooked, that leads one to the truth. But pray, monsieur, do not fear. Speak freely." Reed leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "You may have heard, Monsieur Poirot, that Sir Charles Denham passed away last month, a figure of no small importance in our county. His estate, vast though it may be, is overshadowed now by a peculiar problem. There are papers whose existence was not known until after his death. Their contents disturb me." Poirot inclined his head ever so slightly. "Disturb, you say? That is a word chosen with care, I think." Reed nodded gravely and opened a drawer. From it, he produced a slim bundle tied with faded ribbon. The papers, when untied, gave off that faint, unmistakable scent of old documents, dust, ink faded by years, and something else, a whisper of time itself. Reed placed them upon the desk with a cautious hand. These were discovered in a hidden compartment of Sir Charles's study. Letters, mostly, but there is one, addressed to no one in particular, that suggests he paused. That suggests Sir Charles suspected foul play in his own household. He hints, only hints, at betrayal, deception, and something of a secret long concealed. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, the whisper of old papers, indeed. They speak, monsieur. Always they speak, if one listens." He leaned forward delicately, careful not to touch the documents without permission. "And you call me here to listen also, n'est-ce pas?" "Precisely," Reed murmured. I know not whether these papers should be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man, or whether they conceal a truth that could tear apart what remains of his family. I had thought, given your reputation, that perhaps you might advise." Poirot did not immediately reply. Instead, he allowed silence to sit between them, like a guest neither man acknowledged. He studied Reed's face, the subtle lines of worry upon his brow, the quick dart of his eyes toward the drawer as if fearing something still hidden there. Poirot's little gray cells had already begun their quiet dance. At length he said, "Monsieur Reed, I will assist. But remember this, when one lifts the veil of secrecy, one cannot always control what is revealed. Families, they may be wounded. Reputations, they may be shattered. Yet the truth, it insists on coming forth." Reed inclined his head solemnly. "Understand. And yet, Monsieur Poirot, the Denham family has already known scandal enough. Sir Charles's passing leaves behind Lady Margaret, his widow, and their niece, Miss Evelyn. There are whispers, rumors in town of quarrels, of inheritances contested even before the man was laid to rest." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Eh bien, where there is quarrel, there is motive. Where there is motive, there is often crime. Already I see the shadow of possibilities. I must meet these ladies, monsieur. Arrange it." Reed hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Very well. I shall write to Lady Margaret at once. But Monsieur Poirot," his voice lowered, and he leaned in, "there is something else. The key to the compartment where these papers were hidden, it was not found among Sir Charles's belongings. It appeared from nowhere. A maid discovered it lying upon his desk the morning after his death. How it came there, I cannot say." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained one of quiet composure. "How curious, yes? The dead man. He cannot leave a key upon his desk. Someone wished it to be found. Someone wished these papers to speak." Reed's fingers twitched upon the desk. "Do you think, then, that we stand upon the edge of some darker revelation?" Poirot rose, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous care. "Monsieur Reed, I think only this, that a whisper, once begun, has a way of growing louder until it becomes a voice. And soon, that voice, it will be heard by all." With that, he departed, the scent of old paper lingering in his nostrils, the weight of hidden truths pressing upon his little gray cells. Outside, the wind caught his coat, and the gulls overhead cried their eternal lament over the sea. Poirot walked slowly back through the narrow streets, reflecting upon the curious interplay of secrecy and revelation. He had not yet met the players in this drama, but already the stage was set. The curtain, he felt, would rise soon, and as he walked, the faint rustle of old papers seemed still to echo in his mind, whispering secrets too long concealed. Chapter 3. Shadows Along the Canals. The canals of Bruges had always been a mirror of the city's soul, glistening under the morning light and whispering secrets beneath the cover of fog. As Hercule Poirot and his steadfast companion Captain Hastings walked along the damp stone paths, the murky water reflected not only the lace-like facades of ancient houses, but also the unease that had settled into the very marrow of their case. The mystery of the mapmaker's missing heirlooms had already grown beyond what it appeared to be. The whispers in old papers, the cryptic notations in the margins of a centuries-old ledger, and the deliberate tearing of certain passages had suggested a larger hand at play. But as Poirot gazed into the black ripples of the canal, he seemed to see more than water. He saw patterns, alignments, and movements in shadows that eluded everyone else. Hastings, of course, had remarked only on the cold, tugging his coat closer around his shoulders. Yet Poirot's sharp eyes darted from house to house, noting every shutter closed a fraction too early, every curtain drawn with nervous haste, and every reflection in the canal that did not match what was above. They arrived at a narrow bridge where ivy crawled over the stones, its roots clutching the old structure like veins. Here Poirot paused. He bent to examine the moss growing in the cracks as though it held a clue, and Hastings, exasperated as ever, demanded to know what possible relevance such greenery could have to their investigation. Poirot, with a small smirk, said only that nature often reveals what man attempts to hide. And indeed, as he pointed out with a gloved finger, there were faint impressions of boots along the edge, muddy prints leading directly to the water, fading as though the culprit had slipped into a waiting boat or attempted to disguise his tracks in the currents. Hastings stared, baffled, but Poirot straightened and tapped his temple. "Regardez, mon ami, et murmure. Here is the theater of our adversary's cleverness. He thinks he erases his trail, but in doing so, he reveals the very length of it." As they moved deeper into the quarter, the air grew thicker, not only with mist, but with a tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface of daily life. Market vendors called out half-heartedly, their eyes always glancing over shoulders. The ringing of bicycle bells was hurried, lacking its usual cheerful lilt. Even the swans on the water seemed agitated, churning ripples rather than gliding serenely. Hastings felt it in his bones, though he could not name it. Poirot, however, described it in a low, precise tone. The rhythm of fear, the tempo of a city that knows too much and dares to speak too little. It was here that Poirot first mentioned the canals themselves, not merely as waterways, but as conduits for messages, escapes, and clandestine meetings. More than one witness had hinted that boats were seen gliding at midnight with no lanterns, silent as the dead. A gondolier had gone missing 3 weeks ago. A fisherwoman swore she heard the splash of something heavy being discarded. And in one tavern by the water's edge, a drunken man had whispered of a cartographer's curse before collapsing into incoherence. Each fragment, in isolation, might seem trivial, but to Poirot they formed the edges of a puzzle more intricate than the maps that inspired it. One evening, they were summoned to a narrow townhouse owned by a collector of maritime charts. The man, pale and trembling, handed over an envelope sealed with wax. It had been left upon his doorstep with no trace of who delivered it. Inside was a map, crudely drawn yet eerily specific, marking not the streets of Bruges but the waterways themselves, with certain locations circled in dark ink. Hastings, unnerved, remarked that it looked like a treasure map from some child's adventure story. Poirot, however, studied it for nearly an hour, turning it this way and that, noting how the scale was distorted, how certain bridges were missing, and how one circled site corresponded exactly to the mapmaker's own abandoned garden. A second location lay directly beneath the window of a convent school, and the third pointed to a forgotten quay where the weeds grew thick and rats scurried in daylight. Poirot announced quietly that the sender wished to lead them somewhere, but whether it was to a discovery or a trap remained to be seen. That night, they followed the directions. Lanterns swayed along the canal walls, but most of the city slept, leaving them with only the splash of water against stone and the occasional distant toll of a bell. Hastings, ever the soldier, felt a tightening in his chest, the old anticipation of chase, the fear of an unseen ambush. Poirot, in contrast, walked with measured calm, his eyes sweeping every corner, his ears attuned to the faintest of sounds. They reached the first marked spot, the garden of the late mapmaker, its gates now rusted shut. Within, the fountain had gone dry, and ivy strangled the statues. Hastings muttered about ghosts, but Poirot stooped to examine the soil, discovering recent disturbances, as though something had been unearthed or buried. At the second location, near the convent, they found a shred of fabric snagged on the railing, damp and dark, possibly bloodstained. The third site, the forgotten quay, chilled Hastings most of all, for there, drifting in the shadows, was a boat with no oars, no pilot, only a single candle burning in the center, its flame dancing madly in the breeze. Poirot motioned for silence, then leaned closer. On the side of the boat, faintly scratched, was a symbol matching one he had seen in the torn ledger, the emblem of a compass fractured in two. The significance struck him at once. The symbol was no mere flourish. It was a signature, a claim of ownership over the crimes yet to be revealed. Hastings asked who could be behind such an elaborate design. but Poirot only placed a finger to his lips. He spoke softly of adversaries who delight not only in the crime itself, but in the theater of its unveiling. Men who compose riddles as though they were composers of symphonies, weaving fear and secrecy into every note. The canals were not merely witnesses to these acts. They were accomplices carrying away the echoes, the footprints, the evidence. As dawn approached, Poirot and Hastings returned to their lodgings, the candle-lit boat still drifting in the mist behind them. Poirot, though outwardly serene, confessed that they had crossed into the true heart of the case. No longer the matter of missing heirlooms or fragmented papers, but something older, darker, and rooted in the very veins of the city. The mapmaker's mystery was merely the surface. Beneath lay the vast, shifting waters of a conspiracy that would test even the brilliance of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 4: Shadows at Dusk. The afternoon waned into a velvet dusk, and with it the atmosphere around the estate grew heavier, as though the air itself were thickened by some unseen weight. Poirot, standing upon the terrace, allowed his sharp eyes to travel across the manicured lawns toward the distant tree-line, where the fading sun struggled to set the sky ablaze in streaks of rose and ember. Yet in that same glow, he observed how shadows lengthened with strange haste, swallowing corners and recesses of the grounds where earlier brightness had danced. He remained still, his posture immaculate, but his mind worked ceaselessly, unraveling threads that others would not yet see. The house, grand in its old-world elegance, had begun to feel like a stage upon which something secret rehearsed itself, quietly, insistently, waiting for its inevitable unveiling. Within the drawing-room, Lady Whitcomb, whose demeanor had shifted from refined composure to subtle unease, entertained the remaining guests with polite conversation that rang hollow against the walls. Poirot, rejoining them, noticed how each voice trembled ever so slightly, as though no one dared to address the unspoken. A map had vanished, documents had whispered of secrets, and now a peculiar unease began to crawl over those gathered, like the brush of unseen fingers. Colonel Harrington poured himself a stiff drink, his hands betraying a faint quiver he attempted to disguise with brusqueness. Miss Leclerc, the young archivist, sat by the fire, her profile bathed in orange light, eyes lowered to a book she had not turned a page of in nearly an hour. And yet, Poirot observed her keenly, for he had seen how she glanced at the clock with each passing quarter hour, her lips tightening as though she anticipated a moment that had not yet arrived. Dinner was served at precisely 7, but even the clinking of cutlery and the polite murmur of voices could not smother the undercurrent. Poirot, ever fastidious, arranged his napkin with delicate precision and appeared entirely absorbed in his modest portion of fish. In truth, he noted every glance, every falter, every attempt at casual conversation. Lady Whitcomb inquired after trivialities, weather, society news, travels, but her eyes betrayed distraction, darting toward the French windows that opened onto the garden. The servants, too, seemed unusually hurried, avoiding eye contact as they slipped in and out of the room. Poirot, lifting his fork with deliberate slowness, asked a question so mild that it might have been dismissed as polite interest. "Madam, is it true that this house has stood since the reign of Queen Anne?" Lady Whitcomb confirmed, yet her voice wavered, for she knew as Poirot did that old houses do not merely hold dust and memories. They guard secrets, often unwillingly. When dinner ended, Poirot declined port, choosing instead to wander the corridors of the house. His small, deliberate footsteps echoed against stone floors, carrying him past ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow him with silent disapproval. He paused before one, an old mapmaker, stern and regal, holding a compass in his hand, and inclined his head as though acknowledging an adversary. Shadows curled at the edges of the corridor, and Poirot, unbothered by the encroaching dark, pressed on toward the library. There, with the scent of old leather and the lingering smoke of extinguished lamps, he sought the company of silence. Upon a table lay fragments of parchment, some blank, others bearing scribbles faint enough to evade casual notice. Yet Poirot, with his obsessive attention, saw what others would miss. A notation half erased, a symbol pressed deeper into the fibers, as though its author's hand had trembled with urgency. He bent closer, murmuring, "Voila, whisper that wishes to be heard." The hour grew late. The household dispersed, some to retire, some to linger by the fire in half-hearted conversation. But Poirot remained restless. He walked the grounds once more, where the wind had risen, carrying with it a peculiar rustle. It was not the sound of trees alone. Somewhere in the darkness, papers shifted, a faint fluttering, as though a sheaf of documents moved though no hand touched them. Poirot followed the sound across the lawn, his patent leather shoes immaculate even upon damp grass, until he reached the edge of the garden where hedges rose like walls. There, beneath the growing moonlight, he spied a torn fragment caught among the thorns. It was from the missing map. The ink, blurred at one corner by damp, yet still legible, bore coordinates, cryptic, unfinished, leading to a place not yet revealed. Poirot, delicately retrieving it, raised his head toward the looming house and whispered to the night, "The shadows grow bold, and soon they will speak aloud." Returning indoors, Poirot found Lady Whitcomb waiting in the drawing-room, her figure cloaked in shadow save for the glow of a single lamp. She rose at his entrance, her composure cracking for the briefest instant as her eyes flickered toward the scrap of parchment he now held. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "there are matters in this house which do not wish to be disturbed." Poirot, bowing his head slightly, replied in his measured tone, "And yet, madame, they disturb themselves. One cannot keep silence forever, n'est-ce pas?" Her lips parted, as though she might confess something at last. But before she could speak, the great clock in the hall struck midnight, and with its echo came a sharp cry from the upper floor. Both Poirot and Lady Whitcomb froze, their eyes locked, the silence after the cry stretching long and taut. Then, without hesitation, Poirot turned and ascended the staircase, the click of his shoes ringing like gunshots against the silence, as shadows at last began to show their true shape. Chapter 5. The Midnight Conservatory. The night had wrapped the estate in a cloak of silence, broken only by the faint chirring of insects and the distant hoot of an owl perched somewhere deep in the woods. The grand manor stood solemn, its windows reflecting a pallid moonlight that seemed to sharpen the shadows in every corner. It was precisely at this hour, when most of the household had retired to their quarters, that Poirot found himself drawn back toward the conservatory. The sprawling glass structure that during the day shone like a jewel, but by night loomed like a vast, darkened cathedral of forgotten secrets. He had been restless after dinner, pacing the length of the drawing-room, his little gray cells agitated by the half-formed suspicions that had gathered throughout the day. Something about the estate seemed off, a subtle dissonance like an instrument just slightly out of tune. His instincts whispered to him that the conservatory, with its heavy perfume of rare flowers and its carefully curated wilderness, might conceal a truth no one wished revealed. The walk there was solitary, the gravel crunching softly under his polished shoes as he made his way down the narrow path lit only by the cold glow of the moon. A damp chill clung to the night air, and when he reached the glass-paneled doors of the conservatory, a curious sensation prickled his skin, as though the building itself resented his intrusion. With a measured hand, Poirot pushed open the door. It groaned faintly on its hinges, and at once a wave of humid warmth enveloped him. Inside, the conservatory seemed alive in a way that unnerved the senses. The flowers, though rooted, looked almost watchful, their blooms tilted as if listening. The scent was overpowering, sweet, cloying, mixed with the earthy undertone of damp soil. It was a place of beauty in the day, yes, but at night it had transformed into something altogether more sinister, a hidden garden that breathed with secrets. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and stepped further inside, his sharp eyes tracing the layout with the precision of a cartographer charting unfamiliar land. He noted the arrangement of the plants, orchids and roses placed deliberately along the borders, while rarer species occupied central pedestals beneath shafts of moonlight filtered through the glass ceiling. But what drew him most was the faint rustling sound that came not from him, but from deeper within the chamber. He stilled, every sense alert. Again it came, soft, deliberate, like the brushing of paper against paper. He moved toward it, careful to place each step quietly upon the tiled floor, until he reached the far end of the conservatory where tall palms cast long shadows like bars across the ground. There, half concealed beneath a trellis of ivy, he saw a small table. Upon it lay a stack of old documents, yellowed with age, edges curling as though gnawed by time. Curious, he reached for them, but before his hand touched the parchment, the rustling came again, not from the papers but from the far corner, behind the thick curtain of vines. Poirot drew himself upright, his mustache bristling. "Come out," he said softly but firmly, in that calm Belgian voice that brooked no denial. For a moment there was silence, so complete that he could hear the faint tick of his own watch. Then the vines shifted, and out stepped a figure. It was Mademoiselle Laurent, the young archivist, her pale face half lit by moonlight, her eyes wide with something between fear and defiance. She clutched a folder to her chest, as though it were a shield. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you should not be here." To which Poirot, with a slight incline of the head, replied, "Ah, mademoiselle, but it is you who should not be here. A midnight stroll amongst the flowers? Or perhaps it is not the beauty of the orchids that keeps you awake." His words cut gently but decisively, and he watched her reaction closely. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the folder. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, urgent. "There are things in these records, things not meant for the light of day. If they are discovered, lives will be ruined." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And is it then your task to protect these secrets? Or perhaps to exploit them?" Her silence was telling, and he stepped closer, lowering his tone. "You see, mademoiselle, the truth is like these flowers. You may hide them in shadow, but the scent, it escapes. Always." Before she could answer, a sound shattered the tense moment, a sharp crack, like glass breaking. Both of them turned sharply to see that one of the tall panes of the conservatory had fractured, a jagged split running down its length. Cold night air seeped in, carrying with it a strange, almost metallic tang. Poirot's eyes flicked quickly around the room, noting every exit, every shadow, every possible hiding place. He was certain now. The conservatory was not merely a place of beauty, nor simply a chamber for secrets. It was a stage, and someone else had just entered the game unseen. He gestured for Mademoiselle Laurent to set the folder on the table. "We shall not destroy, nor conceal, mademoiselle. We shall examine. And then, then we shall see whose hand guides these midnight whispers." His voice carried a quiet authority that brooked no refusal, and though her eyes glistened with unease, she obeyed, placing the folder gently down. Poirot opened it, scanning quickly, his gaze sharp as a blade. The papers were maps, old blueprints of the estate, annotated with strange symbols and handwritten notes in a script unfamiliar to him. But one thing struck him immediately. Several sections of the manor were marked with red crosses, including the conservatory itself. He closed the folder with deliberate care, then looked at the young woman. "Mademoiselle, you will tell me everything you know, tout, without omission. For already the danger grows closer, and if I am not mistaken, this conservatory may yet bloom with something far darker than roses." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the glass panes like a warning. Poirot's little gray cells were alive with the scent of a mystery now fully unfurling. The midnight conservatory had revealed its first secret, but he knew it would not be its last.